Here we are. Hand over to Lawrence. Lawrence, you might need to unmute yourself once I've hit mute now.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant.
Great, lovely to see everyone. Thanks so much for coming along on this Monday. And over the next sort of 45 minutes, I'm going to cover this is a session where I cover a lot of the things that we probably know. That we probably, there'll be moments I'm sure you go, yeah, I know that already. And then there'll be other moments where I hope it elicits some further thought on those things as well. And this is sort of the basket of things we don't really know where they fit elsewhere. They don't really fit into vocal training and that sort of thing. They don't really fit into sight singing. It's all the other things around it. So I'm sure it's lots of things that you already know, but worth just recapping already. I'm going to go straight in now with, we're going to talk for the first part about preparation. So when we're preparing for something, and when the director of music tells us in any choir what piece we are about to do, sometimes there's great joy because it's a piece we already know, and sometimes there's great interest because it's a piece we might not know. But of course, the most important thing we can do, regardless of that situation, is get listening to a piece before we start. Listening works for two reasons. One is that we are familiar with the piece before we arrive at the first rehearsal, but also it's worth remembering how we learn. We learn by repeating certain pieces of information into our brain quite regularly. So if we're able to, after a choir practice, the morning, within 12 hours, if we're able to hear the piece of music we learned the night before, and then we do that a day later, and then a week later, that's a really, really good way scientifically of the memory retaining what you've done. So listening can be a really, really strong tool for us. And I think the great advantage nowadays, of course, we've got YouTube, we've got Spotify, we've got all these things we can use. Interestingly, because of course we are Messiah themed this term, I thought as a bit of an experiment, what happens if I just write Messiah into YouTube? And you'll probably quite like to know that the first one is an official trailer for a Netflix documentary. The second one is parts of a British crime drama. And then finally we get to the third one, which says Messiah, brackets, fantastic performance. Now, fantastic performance I think is quite funny because, of course, really that's very, very subjective. In fact, it's so subjective in this case because the person who's giving the performance or who has put the video together has nicked the best parts of everyone's different performances and put them together. So we have to be slightly careful about which performances we're using and which performances are actually going to be helpful to us. And I think I'd just start by saying, I would conclude it by saying, one of the most important things probably nowadays is to judge which period of music you're in. So if you are sort of any composer before 1800, you want to be looking at recordings that are using a Baroque band. So that means the instruments are using historically informed instruments. And that's not just because I enjoy being a bit of a snob about it. It's not that at all. It's because the majority of interpretations that conductors will bring to a choir nowadays will be premised on the idea of those type of recordings. So when you're going to listen for something, look for things like the Academy of Ancient Music, Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. Any of those recordings will generally be really, really good recordings and good ones to learn off. One of the difficulties, and lots of you will know the older recordings, the Beecham recordings, is particularly for Messiah, is that they're hugely over-orchestrated. In For Unto Us a Child is Born of Beecham, he's got a triangle going every single time. You get 1 to 4, counsellor, and it's fine, but it's rather distracting from what we might do nowadays. And the speeds tend to be a lot slower. So yeah, just worth bearing that in mind. So listening, and remembering that when we're listening, we're using that as a tool to develop both pre-rehearsal, before the rehearsal period begins, so we know when we turn up that we're facing fewer variables, and during the rehearsal period, so after the rehearsal, see if you can listen to that recording of those pieces the day after, in your car, on the way to work, whatever it is, and then a day after that, and then a week after that, and it should really sit in there. Good. Let's talk now about warming up. So when we've got a concert and we're warming up for something, and difficult because of course with concerts generally there's not time to do a warm up, and there's not a lot of the time there's not the facilities to do a full warm up as well. Of course there is in at our normal church in Woking, but sometimes it's very hard to find a space to put the whole choral society together. To have a quick warm-up. So you might have to do your own warming up on a concert day. And just two really, really simple tips for warming up. Lots of sirening, as we call it. So I would always use an NG, and the two good things about the NG is that it allows the jaw to be loose. So can be very, very open. You can try this, by the way, now if you like. I don't mind at all. And allows the jaw to be open. Nice and wide, and it allows the tongue to sit at the bottom of the jaw as well, so the tip is touching those back teeth, and from there it's just a really, really simple exercise to get the voice going, and then you sort of expand it either side, and then finally and you can see what I've done with that. So I'm keeping everything here very, very loose. I'm making sure that the tongue doesn't get any more involved other than the back is raised to the palate. And that's a really good way of starting to get the voice nice and warm on a concert day, and I recommend it. The other thing I recommend, we'll come on to this later, but if you are sitting in a concert and you've got, let's imagine you're doing Bach Magnificat, and you've got three, or actually, well, let's stick to Messiah. Let's imagine you're doing Messiah, and in part one, there's some bits where the bass sings for quite a while. Maybe you're sitting down for about 10 minutes or so. Just keep breathing. Breathe through your nose, because people sitting up on a concert stage going like that just looks a bit silly. Breathe through your nose and really use that time to keep filling the lungs. Stay very, very with yourself, almost in a meditative way. And whilst appreciating the music that's going on. So that's just a recommendation for concert day. So we're going through the motions here of things we might want to know. Hydration. There's another one I've spoken about before. Here is my trusty, far too large water bottle. I drink about 2 of these a day, and generally seems to keep me in good health. The recommended amount of water for an adult, or liquids for an adult every day, is 3.6 litres, anywhere between 3 litres and 3.6. And we probably don't drink anything near that generally. But yeah, this is a 2-litre bottle, so if I get through 2 of these, I know that I've exceeded it somewhat. The other thing to know, of course, is to hydrate our body, or at least to get the water to feed onto the vocal cords. It's about 4 hours delay time between drink and the water starting to feed. So at the back of the vocal cords we have 2 little nodules that drip feed water onto the vocal cords, and that just keeps them nice and moist. That's really, really important because we'll all have done a concert where the concert hall gets extremely dry and we're sitting there slightly coughing and wishing we weren't in the quiet moments. And so if we've prepared that beforehand, just allowing that water to drip feed, really, really important. So what I'd recommend with that, drink lots of water on the morning of the concert, that'll keep you going. And try to avoid too many glasses of beer or wine before the concert, which I'm sure you all do, but just a double suggestion in case. Brilliant. I talked about the next thing during our session on vocal health, and that was sort of about posture, because I was showing you lots and lots of diagrams of the body and actually how all the parts, particularly in the upper torso, link into the vocal production. And it's not really about protecting the voice as in this physical area so much as it is trying to get everything to really ground here. And so one of the things I would say from this is when you're sitting down, and I know we don't tend to cross knees, but when we're sitting in a seat, try and make sure your feet are grounded, both toes and heel, onto the floor. And that should allow you to feel a sense that you're sitting upright and alert. When I have to sit in concerts, when I'm doing solos, if I take the B minor Mass, for example, that's one of the worst as the bass soloist, because you sit there for 50 minutes and then you have to stand up and sing a quite jolly, complex aria. And one of the things I'll tend to do is I'll take at least 30 minutes of that period just breathing, very, very simply breathing my way through the whole performance. And that doesn't mean I'm not with people, it doesn't mean I've shut my eyes or I'm sort of drifting off anyway. And people do ask that, what do you do? Why do people look so serious when they're sitting up there? What should you do? And we might talk about that later as well. But I just recommend getting into that position. And often what I find then, if I've got that period where I'm sitting down for a long time, but I've done some really deep breathing, that my diaphragm is ready to operate. I'll have expanded my lung capacity, and when I want to stand up on stage, I'll feel very alert and ready to go. But also stops me coughing and keeps my body temperature at a good, stable temperature as well. So I really, really recommend those things to you. Posture can be really influenced by both breath and also by just keeping our feet very simply on the floor below us, and that allows the spine to stack naturally. If posture is something you find you struggle with, I thoroughly recommend looking into getting an osteopath or chiropractor if possible. It's one of it. This is outside the realms of a music lecture, but I think it's something we really struggle with in the Western world. And if you look in other cultures where they don't sit down at computers for ages and they dance in the evenings, you find they don't have half the problems we have. Half of which are exacerbated by our very moist, wet climate, which tends to increase arthritis in this country as well. But yeah, just recommend that on the off chance that you're thinking, oh, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. I thoroughly recommend it. Really, really enhances your life in a positive way, and it certainly has for me over the past year. Good. I'll just say that the slightly less involved sister of chiropractic and osteopathy is Alexander Technique, and I commend Alexander Technique to you as well if you're interested. Good. And then so lastly on the preparation, I know this is something we all do, but we all bring our pencils to rehearsals. But quite funny, so often when I've seen this on a number of occasions, not particular to Epworth, but with choirs generally, where everyone's got their pencil somewhere, and you say, oh, could we mark this in? And it's like, oh, right, where have I put my pencil? And you think, well, I saw you with it at the start of rehearsal, and it seems to have disappeared. And actually, the thing with having the pencil with you is to mark as you go. Mark things in, and if you're thinking back to that first thing about listening, we're listening the morning after, the day after, and then the week after. If you're marking things thinking, listen to this bit, putting a particular circle, or maybe you invent your own symbol as well to remind yourself to look at that bit, whatever that is, a star or so forth. And is then you've got that, so when you're looking back over the music, you go, yes, that bit's tricky, I'll just have a listen to that again, which of course is so much easier nowadays without tape and CD and all of that. We can just spot straight on it with YouTube. And the other thing I'd recommend as well, of course, we talk about marking up scores a lot of time. We never talk about rubbing out. And it's no bad thing to start saying, well, we might rub out something as we go. I've heard one story and one theory about this. The story was a friend of mine who's a very good vocal teacher, was at Benslow Music. Some of you might have heard of Benslow Music. It's a very, very good place for non-professional musicians who enjoy singing to go and do workshops and so forth. And but this particular workshop he ran every 6 months. He used to get the same people coming along singing the same pieces. And he said, well, one of the slight problems was by the time you went to mark something new in the score, there was so much already written in from the years of workshopping the same piece that there's no room to write another marking. And I would just say, well, of course, what's quite interesting, that tells us something that we go and mark something many, many, many times, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're getting any better at it. So when you're doing that preparation midweek, take the rubber with you and be fully prepared to rub things out as well that are no use to you anymore. And that leads me nicely onto a theory. There's a very good man called Kerry Edwards, I think, who I came and took a rehearsal when I used to play for Windsor and Eton Choral Society, not so far from Guildford and Woking. And he had this theory. He said, we should start with our score completely marked up. So everyone has gone and listened. They mark all the difficult passages in. They mark all the things that they're going to find difficult. They, have written in things that are going to help you as you go. And as the term goes on, you should start rubbing out all the markings, and then eventually you should start rubbing out all the music as well, because you've got to know it. And ultimately you end up with a blank page. And I think funny idea as that is, I think there's a lot of wisdom in it. And I say this because I'm going to come on to something about this in a sec. We get very stuck, don't we, in looking at our copies, in marking into our copies. And I think one of the difficulties, the more we mark, the more likely we are to want to stay into our copies, where actually, as term goes on, we want to be marking things to remember them, use them as a prompt a couple of times, but to be looking up at the conductor more and enjoying it more. So, yeah, just let's have a think about markings on a slightly different level, and just something to think about there. Great. I'm going to, in the next 5-10 minutes, talk about something called Smurf, which is not the blue cat cartoon characters, but this is an anagram for a set of words which can be used to break down music into its elements. And I think the idea of doing this, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, other than to give you an idea what's going on in the conductor's head a lot of the time, but what should be going on in the conductor's head a lot of the time. So the first one of Smurf is S for structure. So when a conductor is looking at a piece of music, they're immediately starting to think about the structure. And we're not just thinking, right, how do I get, this page through to here? But we're thinking about a far longer structure through perhaps the whole 3-hour piece as well. If you were to take the most famous example of this is Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, and many of you may know the very famous opening. That extremely famous chord that feels very lost and open. It's sort of, well, that's quite nice. We can fit that into, and the upper note, we can sort of make it a jazz chord. But when we add the fourth note, very hard to fit that into a chord. And then Wagner, of course, turns into... And that chord equally doesn't feel like it's finished. But it takes 3 hours before you get to the end of the opera, and finally you get... and finally it resolves onto a chord. So for a conductor conducting that piece, of course, they're actually thinking, right, in 3 hours' time, the chord I've been waiting for is going to come. The whole piece is going to resolve. And that will inform certain things about that. But if I was just to take very, very briefly, Behold the Lamb of God from the Messiah, and you don't need your copies, but just having a think about this one. A conductor's going to be thinking, okay, we've got an introduction. A happy times introduction. Okay, what do I want that introduction to sound like? Well, everyone's about to say the word behold. So that's going to inform a certain thing about that. And that takes us through Behold the Lamb of God, and eventually we get to this different theme, don't we? That taketh his So that's the major section. We've been in G minor, but we end up there. And eventually that winds us back around to that wonderful moment, doesn't it? That taketh away the sin. And then the play out. So the whole idea about structure, of course, is the conductor can start thinking about where does he want to pick up elements from the start, put them in there. Where you're going to have contrasting moods are going to be in the major, in the minor section, whatever that is. From a singer's perspective, what's important to think about structure-wise is how, if you've got a 3-hour piece, how are you going to look at this piece? If it's a mass, you're going to be quite familiar with it. But if it's a requiem, say Verdi's requiem, it's what, 2 hours, isn't it? Just over 2 hours. You've got to think very carefully about where's the loudest part going to come. Yes, the conductor will show us these things, but it's also going to help my way of thinking, in terms of stamina about how I get from A to B. So yeah, structure is a huge, huge thing, and I only mentioned that very, very briefly. We talked, by the way, of course, about what you do in the quiet sections of a piece when you're not singing, and that's related to structure as well. But really important, you can tell a choir who's really thought, where each member's thought about the whole piece as an overall one, from a choir which hasn't. And often the choir that hasn't is the one where you can tell that they're just singing the bits they like to sing, and then there's these in-between bits. And so they're never responding to what's going on and seeing the whole thing. It would be like a sort of architectural house built by many architects. It would look terrible. Good. So Smurf, that's our SM melody. Nice and easy, we all know a nice melody. Nice and easy. Good. But of course, what's good about this melody? Triad. So we know what key we're in. It's not our poor Wagner chord. Returns back to that first note. Okay. We've not had this note yet. The highest note of the phrase responds back down. So, of course, what that informs us as a singer, when we just analyse it very, very briefly, and anyone could analyse a piece that way, where does it go, where's the highest note, it really tells us something about the way we're going to sing that. Now, there's no words set to that, but let's pick something from the Messiah. Let's have... How about... For unto us a child is born. Let's use that. So, as a melody, there's something really, really quite simple in that, isn't there? Yum, bum, ba, ya, ba, 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 dum. Any repeated note builds tension. If I just keep repeating a note and eventually change it, it's somehow that last note feels so much more conclusatory than what went before. So, you know, in this one, it really informs the way we might sing that. For unto us a child is born. It's the moment of tension and release at that moment. So we can always think about these little things as we go. And of course, when you get onto the runs in this movement, that's the heavens opening at the top. So melody with really good composers can really tell us something about what we're trying to show. Good. So just having a think about melody in that way from a singing perspective is a really useful thing to do. Great. So that gives us S&M. We've got I, which is instrumentation. Not hugely important, apart from, of course, one of the very obvious things is in a rehearsal, you are rehearsing with a piano, and then when you go listen to recording, you'll normally hear it rehearsed with an orchestra. And one of the good things, now we seem to, with things like the Core app we've been using, we're starting to get far more resources coming online that are A, useful for singers, and B, with piano far more like you would expect to rehearse it, so that when you come, so there's not so much distinction between the rehearsal process and the performance, which is fantastic. But one of the things to really look for when an orchestra arrives on the day, in an ideal world, we would have the orchestra for 3 rehearsals before. But what we can do when we're listening to our recordings with good composers is start thinking about why instruments are used certain ways. It doesn't really apply so much in music before about 1850. So much. Obviously, when the trumpet turns up in Handel, we know that it's probably angels darting around or someone's happy. And in Bach, if the flutes turn up, it's normally the similar thing. In later works, Elgar particularly, huge amount of orchestration going on. If you hear that kind of darkness or something, really go with that colour. Don't just go, oh, that's quite nice. If you're able to adjust your singing so that you're really with that instrumentation. If you hear harsh brass, then sing to that as well. So really thinking about how that instrumentation affects the performance and the way we sing it. Good. Rhythm. So rhythm's quite an interesting one, and this crosses over very much into stuff you've been doing with your sight reading and sight singing. But just some really simple ones here. Are we in 3/time? Are we in 4/time? This is particularly relevant in Pisa. Again, I'm putting this great divide between around 1800, 1850, which is not slightly artificial. But around then, things started changing from 3/time being the preference of, say, the dance, to 4/time. So a lot of Bach, you'll find, Christmas Oratorio, everything in 3/time. And everything dances along. Handel less so. Actually, a heck of a lot of his stuff is in 4/time, and that's just sort of more what was happening in England at that time. But really having that feeling of what the rhythm, what information the rhythm is giving us. I think one of the difficulties with Western music and the way we perform and rehearse Western music is we tend to just sit there and listen to it, and we're sort of told to appreciate what we're hearing, when actually we need to be engaging more. If it was another culture, they'd be dancing to it. I'm always very taken by, I don't know if any of you remember Virgil Fox, the organist from America in the 70s and 80s. And there's this amazing YouTube of him playing the Gigue Fugue by Bach. Fantastic work. Just makes you want to get up and dance, when indeed he actually encourages this entire audience to do that, and by the end there are people dancing reels and jigs in the rows. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It goes to show us what we've lost about this music slightly, by formalising it, putting it in the concert hall. So just really use that as an example to say, go with those rhythms. When you hear those rhythms in the music, really take them for what they are and question them. Good composers want you to ask and find out what the riddle is inside, and that will transmit to an audience. Good. So let's move on. So we've done our smr so far. We've got the th, texture and harmony to finish with. So texturally, this is more relevant to singers. Are we singing together, or are we singing at counterpart to each other? And I would take one of the best examples in the Messiah, of course, to be Since by Man Came Death, where Handel is parodying the Croft funeral sentences. Handel knew a lot of English music at the time. That wonderful Since by Man Came Death. If anyone knows the Croft funeral sentences, so he's just taking a leaf out of his fellow composers. But what's important about this is everyone sings it together. and everyone carries on singing together. By man came horse on the. And so we have to question, what's Handel trying to do here? What's he trying to say about this? Well, there's something very direct about this message, isn't there? Since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. So there's probably a really good reason for that being together. And does that change how we deliver it? Well, it certainly changes how we listen to the parts around us. And I know that sounds such a banal point to make to everyone on here who's obviously a very experienced choral singer. But actually, it really changes how we think about our structure in that part. Are you the main part, or if you're just the bass in that, you're probably just helping the sopranos out. As opposed to if we went to say he trusted in God, he trusted in God that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him if he delight in him. I'm also taken in the life of Brian, where so wonderfully shows how one person saying one rumour turns into a whole crowd saying a rumour, and of course eventually it's got him being chased into the hole in the desert, isn't it, with the shoe and Spike Milligan holding the shoe, which is fantastic. But of course, what's clever going on here? Why didn't he write that all together? He could have written that all together. But for me, it's this idea that someone stands up and says, "Come on, he trusted in God that he'd deliver him, so let him deliver him." And someone says, "Yeah, no, that's right." The tenors then come, say, "Yeah, he did that he would deliver him." And by this time, some more crowd are coming, and the altos start saying, "Yeah, he trusted in God." And finally, the whole crowd is built up, and you've got everyone. But of course, why is it contrapuntal? Well, Handel's representing the chaos of the crowd here. The tenors go, and so on. That absolute interplay of someone being shouted at by a crowd gets harder and harder to hear. And of course, right at the end of this movement, it does come together. One. And it's almost that moment where everyone has, with one voice, agreed it and turned against him. So texture can really influence the drama of what's going on, and always stay aware of that, particularly contrapuntal homophonic texture. Good. Lastly in that list is harmony, which I'm not really going to talk about much today, although I did talk about harmony very briefly with the Wagner example, and I'll just come back to that again, because now this is one of the most complex chords in history and marked a huge turning point in musical development. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture on that, because that's solely worth a lecture on its own, but you'll be glad to hear you're not going to get that today. But of course, what harmony really tells us is, well, harmony is about how we build music together. That's as simple as that. Here is a note. It has no harmony. It could move up and down. It's just a melody, and we associate that most with folk song. So if we had Lyndon Lee, be it a woodland flowery glade by the oak trees mossy mood. Very nice, good, nice and easy. And then Vaughan Williams came along many years later and said, "Oh, I think I could put some harmony in the piano to that." You put two together. Between a woodland flowery glade by the oak trees mossy mood. Oh, lovely. Suddenly it's like music to our ears. So that's harmony at its basic level. But why is it important to conducture, and why does it influence what we do? Of course, harmony is what can bring so much emotion, I think, to us. It gives us a far grander palette of emotion. And in that Wagnerian chord, in our Tristan, when we break that chord down, as I tried to do, I was trying to fit it into a different chord, sort of fits in there. We've got this sad minorness of it. It's quite sad, but when we add that extra note, what what's going on there? Well, in the bass we've got this. Which is not a particularly nice interval. Indeed, in the medieval times, that interval was banned because they believed that the devil actually existed in the interval, which is an interesting theory, but it was banned. And but of course, we know in the story of Tristan and Isolde that their love is forbidden. So the forbidden love is somewhere in that chord. And of course, the whole point of it not resolving is because their love is never resolved until they die together at the end. Now, why is that a good thing for a conductor to think about? Well, they're going to think very carefully about how that chord goes down. You know, if they just beat their way through it. Oh, that just ruined the moment. But if we take that sensitively to let that settle, suddenly the emotion really comes forth from that. So we're always thinking about how does that chord sound? What does that chord give us? And what does that really tell us about the things we're listening to? I'm going to take from the Messiah the very end of the Messiah, the Amen. And of course, we know it's in D major. D major is, here's a harmony thing, associated with triumphantness. All trumpets were generally in D major in Baroque times, and B minor is its chaotic counterpart. So we've got the order of D major and the chaos of B minor. Hence, the B minor Mass is the perfect for the Kyrie. And all of that, and then we end up in D major, which has the same key signature. So that's the order and chaos relationship there. But anyway, final Amen chorus, and lots of playing around in D major here, isn't it? Back at D major. And that could have been the end of the piece. And then Handel does what I think is probably one of the most genius tricks ever pulled off in Western music. And we're in D major, so we've got two sharps, the F sharp and the C sharp. There are two black notes. You see them there and there. There are two black notes. And what he does is he says, right, I'm going to get rid of one of those and see what it does. So he adds this. That moment is one of the most glorious moments, I think, of Western music. Suddenly, and then puts it back in there, the C sharp. And it's just an incredible moment how that can affect the whole piece, just in that lowering down. If I played it the other way, so the piece could finish here, but doesn't. Just sounds a bit more like nice Handel carrying on, but with the C natural. And it really, it's like the opening of heaven for me, that moment. So yeah, really listen for those things and go, wow, that was an incredible thing at that moment. How does he do that? And I'll respond to that by singing a certain way. Good. So that just gives you a brief overview of sort of what a conductor is generally thinking about when they are working together. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up the floor to questions and just see if people have anything they would like to bring up and anything I've said that you'd like to go through. It's really, as I say, this is really the basket of all the things that don't generally get addressed. But do come up for us, and indeed I always tend to think create some barriers in some ways to being in a choir, but these aren't barriers that can be overcome. I hope everything I've kind of spoken about today is things that actually with just a little thought are quite instinctive to those of us who've done some singing before. So I open up the floor, and if anyone's got a question they'd like to come in with, anything, even it's like, how does Handel do this at that moment in the Messiah, I'm more than happy to answer it. Jenny, are you trying to unmute?
No, I was trying to think of something intelligent to ask you.
Oh, well, it doesn't have to be intelligent.
Actually, I have got a question, Lawrence, which is conductors sort of quite often have their own opinion about how fast to play a piece, or what speed to go. What sort of drives that? Is it something that's very individual, or are you very much guided by what the composer perhaps intended?
I think it's a really, really good question. Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, this is a really fascinating one. There's so many factors at play when picking a speed. And conductors start at different places. Really, the composer would probably hope that you start with their metronome mark, but of course Handel, Bach, Mendelssohn didn't leave us many of those, and really your own liberty to work that out. And indeed, there are situations where composers have left a metronome mark, and it just never works. It's either far too fast or too slow. And I shall not name a particular conductor who had a bust up with a particular composer in a recording session, but the composer did walk out because the conductor refused to take the piece at the speed he said. And so it can be with living composers quite a sensitive issue. But I think there's lots at play. I think you've got to be cautious about the choir you're working with, start there, or the orchestra you're working with. You've got to be aware of the acoustic you're going to be performing in ultimately. So let's imagine you're taking For Unto Us into Guildford Cathedral. If you go hell for leather at that speed, all those will probably just get lost somewhere in the dome. So then you're in a balancing act of trying to find, okay, what speed keeps the music alive but allows it to be heard. Michael will probably have his own opinion on this, but I always tend to think of music a little like a flight. So you've got a plane, and you never want to get to a stall speed or a speed where there's that concern that it might all drop. And you're allowed to drop a little close to the floor, but you at least try and keep that going. And there are we talk about stall speed sometimes where things just come to a grinding halt. Particularly, you find it with very, very good choirs where the conductor puts the final beat of the piece down and the choir follow about 5 or 6 seconds later, because that's just the what people have got used to. So I think there's a heck of a lot that goes into thinking about what speed to take a piece, and it has to come from lots and lots of different factors. Another thing as well, I'm just going to nip back to, Paul Wagner keeps getting the blooming outing today. But if I take the start of Tristan, it's actually in 6/8, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, you don't necessarily know that when you hear it, but if you crash through it too fast, it suddenly turns into a nice waltz, which is not where we're heading. At the same time, if you take it so slow, that note's just going to become interminably long, and then by the time you move to the next thing, you go, oh, I've forgotten what even went before. So speed has to be dictated by also what we can interpret across a time period. If you let something go too slowly, we just don't hear that happen at the right speed. I'm actually just to take a quick thing from the Messiah briefly for this question. If we were to take, let's take "Surely He hath borne our griefs," which is marked largo e staccato, and largo could be interpreted the wrong way here. It could be. Which is fine, but it loses something of the urgency for me in those words. Surely he's done this. And that kind of urgency comes, doesn't it? So there's lots and lots of factors to think about. The other thing, of course, is then you're thinking, a conductor will think harmonically as well, last thing I say on it, so that they're thinking, well, where does the piece go? Because if you've got a piece that just sticks on one chord for absolutely ages, then it moves. If you've taken this first bit far too slowly, the second chord just won't feel related to the first, and at that point music starts to really stall. That's that all playing into it there. I hope that goes somewhere to answer it. Michael might have some thoughts as well.
Funnily enough, I was thinking all the time that you were saying this, I'm going to talk about this in a couple of weeks when I do my analysis of all the recordings of Messiah that exist. But one of the things that I find really interesting is this idea that when a piece of music is recorded nowadays, 99.9% of the time, it's in a kind of recording venue, recording studio context. It's very unusual that you would have a recording of a big Mahler symphony from a big cathedral somewhere, let's say, or more often than not, recordings now are done in a studio context. And how much does that actually impact the way the music's performed? And also knowing that if you record a Mahler symphony or a tiny number of players in a piece of Bach, everyone is pretty much going to have a microphone pointing at them up close. And does that kind of change the way people perform, because they know that in a recording context everything is so close and immediate, whether you're singing or playing an instrument or whatever? I think I don't know whether that actually impacts on the way people perform more than they would do in just a normal concert setting. But I don't know, it's an interesting thought. And also the psychology of it. And actually, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Lawrence, is your experience as a performer, and particularly as a singer, where it's such a physical and a human. You are your own instrument, really. It's such a personal and physical thing. Do you find that in any performance, whether it's a huge work or a short piece, something you've never sung before or something you've sung a million times before, do you find that you have a journey of energy through that? Do you think no matter what the performance is, do you always find that you kind of may start to flag slightly 2/3 of the way through, or actually does that not happen anymore? Or do you find that there's a sort of danger of getting tired and lethargic earlier on? And if so, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think I'm always trying to get that balance right. And I'd be as basic to start with and say that the concerts where I tend to flag are the ones where I've had a busy week. So just actually making sure physically you're ready for a concert is a really important part of being prepared for a performance. I mean, any actor any musician would tell you that. So, but I think. Trying to stay present in a piece is also about engaging with what's going on. Harder to do, say, in a mass, but let's imagine you're doing a passion. Then you want to be engaged with action. You want to imagine you're seeing that going on at the time, and that generally, as long as you're with that narrative, and you've done enough practice before, I generally find that physically I don't run into too many problems. But you'll know this, Michael, as well. Is a piece. I was talking about this idea of structure and meta structure. Being able to, a good conductor knowing that over 3 hours, where the real height of it's going to be, can really influence how you as a musician respond. If your orchestra behind you are hacking away at every single movement, that's actually really tiring, because you've got to work really hard then to make sure that your part is kind of heard in the overall performance. Yes, audibly it will be heard, but the energy you're outputting is going to be slightly different to that. I just interesting. Just a thought. I went and watched the whole ring cycle when Daniel Barenboim did it in 2014 at the Proms. And I'll never forget, there were moments where he just put the baton down and had to wipe his brow, and the orchestra just carried on playing, and it was no problem. But I tell you, when we got to the 15th hour, and it was done over 4 nights, but nevertheless, when we got to the 15th hour and the huge climax in Götterdämmerung, which is sort of a summation of the entire thing, I've never seen a conductor work so hard or an orchestra play so hard, because he had just built the whole thing ready for that moment on whenever it was, Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock. He knew that was going to be the biggest moment. And so that can make a performance astonishingly exciting.
Yeah, on a slightly smaller scale to doing the ring cycle, I've often found when we do, we as Epworth Choir and with other groups as well, when you have a program that's lots of shorter pieces, it's actually really hard psychologically to get your teeth into it sometimes, because you're no sooner getting going and then 3 minutes, 4 minutes later, that piece is done and you're on to the next, and that's a different piece altogether, and then you're on to the next. And you might think that something like that's a little bit easier because it's changing and it's constantly stimulating, and because it's you're moving from one thing to the next. But actually I find those quite difficult, and there is something to be said for getting your teeth into a piece that's just much longer and being able to see a bit more of a journey with it in a concert context.
I think it's difficult in regardless of non-professional or professional choirs. I find that the as I call them, bitty programs, a little bit here, they're really hard. You're constantly adjusting. And as everyone will see today, I was talking about the smurf. Well, often, you're moving between so much different style of melody, instrumentation, all those things. It's very difficult to do.
I think, and I think with those big things, particularly things like, be it a Wagner opera or whatever, no matter who the composer is, if you're in a longer piece, you just get into that whole language and you get into that style and you start to know what to expect and what the composer uses in the way of techniques of texture and harmony or whatever, and that can then feed into the way you perform it.
And I think when bear in mind, a lot of recordings we listen to are done in sessions where they plan to if you've got a CD of an assortment of stuff, it's not all recorded at once. And I find it fascinating, even with top groups like King Singers. Go listen to them do a real variety program, and then go listen to the CD. And yes, obviously the CD, they've got time to do more polishing of the sort of general ethereal sound, but you get far more of a dynamic out of the singers having to work their way through different styles, and it's a lot more exhausting.
Definitely. I know from lots of recordings that I've had to do, that Lawrence, you've been involved with as well, and one sits there with the producer and you think, okay, we've got sort of 10 really upbeat tracks and 10 really downbeat tracks, let's say, or much softer numbers, and you put the loud upbeat stuff at 9 o'clock in the morning because everyone's going to be a bit rough and ready but full of vim and vigor, so you get that stuff out of the way early in the morning, and then know that by the middle of the sessions everybody will be in a nice groove, and then you can do the more sort of detailed exposed stuff. But then, as you say, when the finished product comes out, it's all got a lovely flow to it, and nobody's any the wiser that you've cheated your way through it in the recording session. So yeah, it's so much about psychology, isn't it? I always remember, a couple of the conductors that I've watched and worked with, and people who've been mentors, and lots of them have said, you can have the best conducting technique in the world, but essentially it's all psychology. You need to get people to try and do what you want, basically. And if you can show it and you've got a good conducting technique, then brilliant. But it's about the psychology. And I think as far as singing goes as well, that's a big part of it. I know, Lawrence, you and I know singers who perhaps don't have a Rolls Royce voice, but they're just such good performers that it kind of more than makes up for the fact they're a sort of B+ rather than an A+ singer. And likewise the other way around. I'm sure we've all come across singers and instrumentalists who might be technically absolutely unbelievable. But if there's no kind of twinkle in the eye and no sort of innate ability to communicate it, then it's all a bit mediocre, really, no matter how good their raw ability is. It's a marriage of the two, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you gave me some funny memories thinking of those morning sessions where we bury the warm up in a loud piece. But yeah.
Well, I also just find those recording sessions wonderful, that you rock up at 8:59 and 45 seconds, and then the light goes on at 9 o'clock, and everybody just sort of like a load of ants just run onto the stage. Light goes on, and everybody just as if they've been there for hours warming up and practicing and preparing. So yeah, it's a funny psychology, isn't it, getting around all those things. But anyway, thanks, Lauren, so much. It's a really interesting, really fascinating everything you've said, and stuff that's tangible that we can all think about. You, me, everybody who sings in the choir, you know, there's always stuff to think about. And again, I think so much of it is psychological, and so much is just about being well prepared. And the preparation is everything from, have you listened to the score? Have you looked through it before a rehearsal? Right up until is how good is your breath before you sing the very first note of a piece, and all the ways that one prepares oneself. And also, you know, as I touched on a couple of weeks ago in my sight reading one, just this idea that it is a language. It's a kind of, you know, it's like you were reading French or German or whatever, and you can glean a lot of information just from the shape of it and the lengths of the sentences and the complexity of the vocabulary, even before you've heard a word spoken or understood what a word of it means. I think there's so much of that about music as well. It's just look at it, read it like a book, and there's a lot of information there before anybody's even sung a note or played an instrument or anything.
Yeah, absolutely, and just be fascinated by music as well. I think one of the slight sadnesses I have of a lot of music being pumped out on our classical radio stations is we tend to centre around the same hits again and again, and you know, just be fascinated. Why does that sound good? Why is that interesting? What's the composer doing here? And those answers are really close to the surface. So you'll find them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot in there, and you know, if people haven't already got a Spotify account, I would really recommend getting one for exactly the reason that Lawrence has just said. That what I find so amazing about Spotify is that, you know, you can put on an album of Bach piano music, let's say, and then when that album finishes, it automatically starts feeding you other stuff, some Rameau, some Telemann, some Couperin, some other types of solo keyboard music. And I have Spotify on either on my phone, headphones, computer, pretty much every day, and it still throws new music at me. Once it's finished playing what I've selected it to play, you know, it keeps sending you stuff, and I just think it's amazing for introducing you to new things. And you know, historically, we'd put on a CD of Bach, and when that CD was done, you'd take it off and put another one. But one of the real pluses about these streaming services is that they will, you know, it can keep going, and it's clever, and it learns what you like, and it will introduce you to new things. So yeah, just keep listening and learning, and yeah, there's amazing resources out there just to keep expanding our knowledges as we go. Brilliant. Well, bang on the hour. I just say, on behalf of everybody and from me, thank you very much, Lawrence. It's been really, really fascinating and insightful. Thank you to all of you for joining. And yes, we've been nicely set up now for the final session in 2 weeks, which I'm doing, which is looking at various different recordings of Messiah, talking about everything from, you know, why is that one a lot faster than that one? Or everything, instruments used, performance practice, speeds, everything. So it'll be quite an interactive one with lots of music and videos going in that. So that'll be 2 weeks, and that'll finish our series of Messiah workshops. Have a lovely day, folks. Great to see you all, and see you on Wednesday. Thanks again, Lawrence. Take care.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.